In the dusty town of Tombstone, Arizona, where secrets buried themselves deeper than silver veins and truth was rarer than rain, a young woman stepped off the evening stagecoach with nothing but a worn leather satchel and eyes that held mysteries darker than the desert night. Sarah May clutched her belongings close, her calloused hands trembling not from the October chill of 1887, but from the weight of the lie she was about to live. The other passengers hurried past her toward the Golden Nugget Saloon, their boots echoing against wooden planks, but Sarah May stood frozen in the amber glow of oil lamps, knowing that once she crossed that threshold into deception, there would be no turning back. She had traveled 800 miles from Charleston, South Carolina, carrying a secret that could either save her life or destroy everything she had ever known about herself. The telegram in her pocket, creased from countless readings, bore only 5 words that had changed her destiny forever. "Come quickly, your father dying." But Sarah May had never known her father, and the man who sent that message had no idea he was summoning someone whose very existence would shatter the carefully constructed world of the most powerful ranch owner in all of Arizona Territory. 3 weeks later, as autumn winds carried whispers across the endless expanse of the Double Diamond Ranch, something in the servant girl's movements made cattle baron Jackson Whitmore stop dead in his tracks. He had been watching her scrub the front porch steps with the same methodical precision she brought to every task, but now she lifted her head to gaze at the horizon, and in that single moment, 23 years collapsed like a house of cards. The way she tilted her chin toward the setting sun, the exact angle of her profile against the golden light, the unconscious grace with which she pushed a strand of auburn hair from her forehead. It was like looking at a ghost. Jackson's weathered hands gripped the porch railing until his knuckles turned white, his mind racing back to a Charleston ballroom in 1864, to a waltz that lasted forever and a woman whose laughter had echoed in his dreams for over 2 decades. But that woman was dead, had been dead since the war ended, and the girl standing before him was nothing more than a servant he had hired sight unseen through a newspaper advertisement. Yet as she turned those startling green eyes toward him, eyes that held depths of intelligence no servant girl should possess, Jackson Whitmore realized that everything he thought he knew about his past was about to unravel in ways that would test not only his sanity, but the very foundations of his empire. Sarah May had answered the advertisement for a house servant with desperate efficiency, knowing that working on a remote ranch would provide the perfect hiding place from those who hunted her in Charleston. The Pinkerton detectives hired by her late mother's family would never think to look for Elizabeth Catherine Ashworth, last surviving heir to the Ashworth textile fortune, among the dust and cattle of Arizona Territory. She had burned her silk dresses and fine jewelry, trading them for practical calico and worn boots, transforming herself from Southern belle to common servant through sheer determination and the acting skills her governess had once praised. The journey west had been treacherous, but not nearly as dangerous as staying in South Carolina, where her uncle's greed and her stepfather's violent temper had made her life a living nightmare after her mother's suspicious death. Now, as she swept the endless dust from Jackson Whitmore's sprawling ranch house, Sarah May told herself that this deception was temporary, just until she could figure out her next move. But she had not counted on the kindness in the rancher's eyes, or the way he treated his workers with respect rather than contempt, or how the vast beauty of the desert landscape began to heal wounds in her soul she didn't even know existed. Jackson Whitmore had built his empire from nothing, arriving in Arizona Territory with empty pockets and a broken heart after losing everything in the Civil War. The Double Diamond Ranch now stretched across 40,000 acres of prime grazing land, employing over 60 cowboys and supporting 3 small towns that had grown up around his various enterprises. He was known throughout the territory as a fair but demanding boss, a man whose word was his bond and whose generosity toward those in need was matched only by his ruthlessness toward those who betrayed his trust. At 52, he had never married, though not for lack of opportunities. The eligible daughters of ranchers and business owners from Phoenix to Tucson had made their interest clear over the years. But Jackson's heart remained locked away, buried with memories of a woman named Catherine Ashworth whom he had met during the darkest days of the war. A woman whose love had briefly illuminated his world before tragedy tore them apart forever. He told himself he hired the servant girl because she worked hard and asked no questions, not because something about her presence stirred emotions he had spent decades learning to ignore. The first sign that Sarah May was not what she appeared came on a Tuesday morning in November, when Jackson discovered her in his study reading one of his leather-bound volumes of Shakespeare. She looked up with startled eyes, clearly expecting anger, but instead found curiosity in his weathered face. Most servants on the frontier could barely write their own names, yet here was a young woman who not only read fluently but had been taking careful notes in the margins with handwriting that belonged in a ladies' finishing school, not a ranch house kitchen. When questioned, Sarah May claimed her former employer had taught her letters, but the explanation felt thin as morning mist. Jackson began watching her more carefully, noticing how she instinctively used the good china when serving his meals, how she arranged flowers with the practiced hand of someone raised among luxury, how she sometimes forgot herself and spoke with the refined accent of Charleston high society before quickly dropping back into the rougher speech patterns she had adopted as camouflage. The mystery deepened when Jackson caught glimpses of Sarah May staring at the daguerreotype on his mantelpiece with an expression of profound sadness. The photograph showed him as a young cavalry officer standing beside a beautiful woman in an elaborate ball gown, taken during a brief leave in Charleston just weeks before the Battle of Atlanta changed everything. Catherine Ashworth had been the daughter of a wealthy textile manufacturer, a woman whose intelligence and compassion had captivated Jackson completely during their brief courtship. They had planned to marry after the war, but Catherine died in a carriage accident while traveling to visit wounded soldiers in a Richmond hospital, her generous heart leading her to the same fate that claimed so many during those terrible years. Jackson had never spoken of her to anyone on the ranch, yet something in Sarah May's expression when she looked at that photograph suggested a connection he couldn't begin to understand. The truth began emerging in fragments, like pieces of a shattered mirror reflecting distorted images of the past. Sarah May started asking seemingly innocent questions about Jackson's time in Charleston, about the families he had known there, about what had happened to the grand houses and their inhabitants after the war ended. Her inquiries were casual, woven into conversations about daily ranch business, but Jackson's instincts told him there was nothing casual about her interest. He began his own investigation, writing letters to contacts in Charleston and consulting with a private detective in Phoenix who specialized in background checks for employers who needed to verify their workers' identities. What he discovered made him question everything he thought he knew about the servant girl who had quietly become an essential part of his household's daily rhythm. Meanwhile, Sarah May struggled with her growing feelings for the man she was deceiving. Jackson Whitmore was nothing like the men who had controlled her life in Charleston, her manipulative uncle who saw her only as a means to access her inheritance, her stepfather who had made increasingly threatening advances after her mother's death, the various suitors who viewed her as a prize to be won rather than a person to be cherished. Jackson treated her with respect and kindness, never raising his voice or making demands beyond reasonable work expectations. She watched him interact with his cowboys and the townspeople who depended on his ranch for their livelihoods, saw how he quietly helped families in need and paid fair wages even when market prices dropped. This was a man of integrity, and with each passing day, the weight of her deception grew heavier. She found herself wanting to tell him the truth, but fear held her back, fear that he would send her away, fear that somehow her enemies would find her, fear that revealing her identity would destroy the peace she had found in this unlikely refuge. The first major crisis came when a group of strangers arrived in Tombstone asking questions about a missing woman from Charleston. The Pinkerton detectives her uncle had hired were thorough and persistent, showing around a photograph that bore enough resemblance to Sarah May to make her blood run cold. Jackson noticed her nervousness immediately, saw how she avoided going into town for supplies, and how she jumped at unexpected sounds. When he pressed her for an explanation, Sarah May broke down and revealed part of the truth, that she was running from men who meant her harm, that her name wasn't really Sarah May, that she had come west to escape a dangerous situation back home. But she still couldn't bring herself to tell him about her real identity or her connection to his past, terrified that the revelation would change everything between them. Jackson's protective instincts kicked in immediately. Without knowing the full story, he made it clear that no one would harm anyone under his protection, posting extra guards around the ranch and making discreet inquiries in town about the strangers who were asking questions. His actions touched Sarah May deeply, but they also intensified her internal conflict. Here was a man willing to risk his own safety to protect her, and she was repaying his kindness with lies. The guilt began eating away at her, affecting her sleep and her appetite, making her increasingly withdrawn despite Jackson's gentle attempts to draw her out of her shell. The breaking point came during a winter storm that trapped everyone on the ranch for 3 days. With nothing but time and proximity, Jackson and Sarah May found themselves talking for hours by the fireplace, sharing stories and dreams in a way that felt natural despite the deception underlying their relationship. Sarah May spoke carefully about her childhood, editing out details that would reveal her true background, but she couldn't hide her education or her refined sensibilities. Jackson found himself falling in love with this mysterious woman who read poetry with tears in her eyes and spoke about injustice with passionate conviction. When the storm finally broke and normal routine resumed, both of them knew that something fundamental had changed between them, a shift that made the continuation of their charade both more essential and more unbearable. The revelation came in the most unexpected way. While cleaning Jackson's bedroom, Sarah May accidentally knocked over a small wooden box hidden behind other items in his wardrobe. Letters spilled across the floor, and as she gathered them up, her own name seemed to leap off the yellowed pages. But not Sarah May Catherine. Letter after letter written in Jackson's younger hand, never sent, addressed to Catherine Ashworth in Charleston. Love letters full of promises and dreams, expressions of grief over her death, plans for a future that would never come. With shaking hands, Sarah May read words written by a man who had loved her mother with the same intensity she was beginning to feel for him. Words that revealed a connection she had never imagined possible. The truth hit her like lightning illuminating a dark landscape. Jackson Whitmore was not just any rancher. He was the cavalry officer her mother had spoken of in her final days, the lost love Catherine had mourned until her death 23 years later. Sarah May wasn't just Catherine's daughter. She was the child of the man who had unknowingly given her sanctuary, the living proof of a love story that had transcended war and separation and death itself. The telegram that had brought her west hadn't come from her dying father as she had assumed, but from Jackson's lawyer, who had been trying to locate Catherine's family to fulfill a provision in Jackson's will that left part of his estate to Catherine or her heirs. The emotional impact of this discovery was overwhelming. Sarah May realized that her resemblance to her mother had been triggering Jackson's memories from the moment she arrived, that his kindness toward her had been influenced by subconscious recognition of features that haunted his dreams. But she also understood that her mother had never told Jackson about her pregnancy, had let him believe she died without leaving any part of herself behind. Catherine had made that choice to protect both Jackson and her unborn child from the social scandal that would have destroyed them all in the rigid society of Reconstruction-era Charleston. When Jackson found Sarah May sitting on his bedroom floor surrounded by his letters, both of them crying, the last barriers between truth and deception finally crumbled. Through tears and broken words, Sarah May revealed her real name, her true identity, and the circumstances that had brought her to his ranch. She told him about growing up hearing stories of a brave cavalry officer named Jackson who had loved her mother completely but had been lost to the war, about Catherine's deathbed confession that her greatest regret was never telling Jackson about his daughter, about the uncle's schemes and the stepfather's threats that had finally driven her to flee Charleston in search of the father she had never known. Jackson's reaction was everything Sarah May had feared and hoped for simultaneously. The initial shock gave way to overwhelming joy as he realized that the woman he loved was not only alive through their daughter, but had given him the greatest gift imaginable. The servant girl he had been falling in love with was his own flesh and blood, the child of his heart's greatest love, a living bridge between past and future that he had never dared to dream possible. But along with joy came crushing guilt. He had been developing romantic feelings for his own daughter, had been betraying Catherine's memory by allowing himself to love again without knowing the truth. The revelation transformed everything while changing nothing essential. The love between Jackson and Sarah May had to be redefined, shifted from romantic to paternal, but its depth and sincerity remained unchanged. Jackson threw himself into making up for 23 lost years, teaching Sarah May everything about ranching and the West, sharing stories of her mother that filled in gaps in her understanding of Catherine's character and dreams. Sarah May, in turn, helped heal wounds in Jackson's heart that had festered for decades, proving that Catherine's love had indeed survived in the most beautiful way possible. But their newfound happiness faced immediate threats. The Pinkerton detectives were closing in, and Sarah May's uncle had arrived in Arizona territory personally, armed with legal documents claiming guardianship and demanding her return to Charleston to face charges of theft related to her mother's estate. Jackson's wealth and influence provided some protection, but the law was clear until Sarah May reached her 25th birthday in 6 months. Her uncle retained legal control over her decisions. The battle that followed tested every resource Jackson had built over decades of hard work, every alliance he had forged with judges and politicians, every favor he was owed throughout the territory. The climactic confrontation took place in the Tombstone Courthouse, where Sarah May's uncle presented his case with cold legal precision while Jackson fought with the desperation of a father protecting his child. Evidence emerged of the uncle's financial mismanagement and his stepfather's increasingly violent behavior, painting a picture of greed and abuse that had driven Sarah May to flee for her life. But the law still favored male guardianship, and it seemed that legal technicalities would force Sarah May back to Charleston despite the obvious dangers she would face. The turning point came when Sarah May herself took the stand and, with quiet dignity, told her complete story for the first time. She spoke of her mother's love for Jackson, of growing up hearing stories of his honor and integrity, of the desperate flight west to escape men who saw her only as a means to wealth and power. Her testimony, combined with Jackson's reputation throughout the territory and the obvious love between father and daughter, swayed public opinion decisively in their favor. The judge, himself a father, ruled that Sarah May's safety took precedence over legal guardianship, granting her emancipation and the right to remain in Arizona under Jackson's protection. The resolution brought peace but also profound changes to both their lives. Sarah May legally took the name Sarah Catherine Whitmore, honoring both her heritage and her new beginning. She became Jackson's partner in running the ranch, bringing Eastern business acumen to complement his Western practicality, expanding their operations into new territories and enterprises. The Double Diamond Ranch prospered under their joint management, becoming not just a cattle operation but a symbol of what could be accomplished when intelligence and determination combined with opportunity and hard work. Jackson found new purpose in his role as father and mentor, teaching Sarah May everything he knew about leadership and business, while learning from her fresh perspectives and innovative ideas. The loneliness that had haunted him for decades disappeared, replaced by the daily joy of watching his daughter grow into a formidable woman who combined Catherine's compassion with his own strength and determination. He finally felt that Catherine's death had meaning, that her love had indeed survived in the most beautiful and lasting way possible. Years later, as Jackson watched Sarah May ride across their lands with her own children, he reflected on the mysterious ways life could heal old wounds and fulfill impossible dreams. The servant girl who had pretended to be someone else had revealed truths more profound than either of them could have imagined, proving that love, in all its forms, was indeed the most powerful force in the universe. The Double Diamond Ranch stood as testament to what could be accomplished when deception gave way to truth, when fear transformed into courage, and when the past and present merged to create a future neither had dared to envision. The woman who had come west as a lie had become the most honest and authentic part of Jackson's world, the daughter whose existence proved that some love stories transcend time itself, echoing across decades to find their perfect, unexpected resolution in the vast and unforgiving beauty of the American frontier. The years that followed brought challenges that tested the strength of the bond between Jackson and Sarah May in ways neither had anticipated. The Double Diamond Ranch became a target for land speculators and railroad companies, who saw opportunity in the vast acreage Jackson had accumulated over decades of careful expansion. Legal battles became a constant presence in their lives, with Eastern businessmen attempting to use Sarah May's Charleston connections against them, claiming that her inheritance rightfully belonged to creditors of her uncle's failed enterprises. Each court appearance required Sarah May to relive the trauma of her flight west, but she faced these challenges with the same quiet courage that had brought her to Arizona in the first place. Jackson's health began declining in his 65th year, not from any specific ailment but from the accumulated wear of a lifetime spent building an empire from nothing. The harsh Arizona sun and decades of physical labor had taken their toll, and though he tried to hide his increasing fatigue from Sarah May, she recognized the signs with the intuition that comes from truly knowing someone's heart. She gradually assumed more of the ranch's daily operations, proving herself to be not just her father's daughter in appearance and intelligence, but in the strength of character that commanded respect from hardened cowboys who had initially doubted whether a woman could truly understand their world. The most difficult test came when drought struck the territory for 3 consecutive years, decimating cattle herds and forcing smaller ranchers into bankruptcy. The Double Diamond's vast water rights, secured through Jackson's foresight decades earlier, became both a blessing and a burden as desperate neighbors begged for access to the springs and wells that meant the difference between survival and ruin. Sarah May advocated for sharing their resources, while Jackson worried that generosity would ultimately destroy everything they had built. Their debates over dinner became heated discussions about the responsibilities that came with power, the balance between charity and self-preservation, and the legacy they wanted to leave for future generations. During this period, Sarah May met Dr. Thomas Morrison, a young physician who had come west to establish a medical practice in the growing town of Phoenix. Thomas was unlike the men who had pursued her in Charleston. He saw her as an equal partner rather than a prize to be won, respected her business acumen as much as her beauty, and understood that her heart would always belong first to the ranch and the father who had given her sanctuary. Their courtship was conducted under Jackson's watchful but approving eye, with Thomas proving his worthiness not through grand gestures but through his treatment of the ranch hands' families and his willingness to make house calls during the worst of the drought when medical care could mean the difference between life and death. Jackson initially struggled with the prospect of Sarah May's marriage, not from any dislike of Thomas but from fear of losing the daughter he had found so late in life. Sarah May understood his concerns and worked carefully to help him see that love multiplied rather than divided, that gaining a son-in-law could strengthen their family rather than diminish it. Thomas, for his part, made it clear that he had no intention of taking Sarah May away from the ranch that had shaped her, proposing instead to establish his practice in Tombstone where he could serve the community while remaining close to the life she had built with her father. The wedding took place on a spring morning in 1891, with wildflowers blooming across the desert and the entire community of ranchers, townspeople, and cowboys gathering to celebrate the union. Jackson walked Sarah May down an aisle formed by their employees and neighbors, his pride evident in every step. The ceremony was simple but profound, conducted by a circuit preacher who spoke about the mysterious ways love could transform lives and bring healing to old wounds. As Sarah May and Thomas exchanged vows, Jackson felt Catherine's presence more strongly than he had since finding her letters all those years ago, as if his beloved was blessing their daughter's new beginning from beyond the grave. The years of marriage brought grandchildren who filled the ranch house with laughter and energy Jackson had never imagined possible. Sarah May balanced motherhood with her responsibilities as ranch manager, teaching her children the same lessons about integrity and hard work that Jackson had instilled in her. The oldest, Catherine, inherited her grandmother's beauty and her grandfather's business sense, while young Jackson showed promise as a natural horseman who could gentle the wildest Mustang with patience and understanding. Thomas established himself as one of the territory's most respected physicians, his medical practice growing as word spread of his skill and compassion. But the greatest joy came in watching Jackson transform into a grandfather. The man who had spent decades building walls around his heart to protect himself from further loss opened himself completely to these new relationships. He taught his grandchildren to ride and rope, shared stories of the old days when Arizona was still wild territory, and passed on the values that had guided him through decades of triumph and hardship. The children adored him completely, seeing not the feared cattle baron that others knew but the gentle man who carved wooden toys and told bedtime stories about brave cowboys and clever horses. As Jackson entered his 70th year, he began making preparations for the inevitable transition of ranch ownership. Rather than simply leaving everything to Sarah May in his will, he worked with lawyers to create a complex trust that would protect the ranch from future challenges while ensuring that the land would remain in family hands for generations to come. The legal documents were carefully crafted to prevent the kind of inheritance disputes that had driven Sarah May from Charleston, with provisions that protected her children and their children from the greed and manipulation that had characterized her uncle's behavior. The end came not with dramatic fanfare but with quiet dignity that reflected how Jackson had lived his life. On a warm October evening in 1895, 8 years after Sarah May had first arrived at the ranch as a frightened servant girl, Jackson suffered a heart attack while sitting on the front porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Sarah May held his hand as he passed, both of them knowing that he was finally going to rejoin Catherine in whatever realm awaited beyond this life. His last words were of gratitude, thankfulness for the years they had shared, pride in the woman Sarah May had become, and wonder at the mysterious ways fate had brought them together when both needed family most. The funeral drew people from across the territory and beyond, testament to the respect Jackson had earned through decades of fair dealing and quiet generosity. Sarah May stood beside his grave with dry eyes and a steady voice, speaking not of loss but of gratitude for the father who had given her everything she needed to build a meaningful life. She told the gathered crowd about the servant girl who had found her true home, about the rancher who had discovered that love could indeed transcend death, and about the power of truth to heal even the deepest wounds. In the months that followed, Sarah May proved herself worthy of the legacy Jackson had entrusted to her. The Double Diamond Ranch continued to prosper under her leadership, expanding into new ventures while maintaining the values of integrity and community service that had always defined their approach to business. She established a school for ranch children, built a hospital to serve the growing population of the territory, and created a foundation that provided assistance to families facing the kinds of desperate circumstances that had once driven her to flee Charleston. The servant girls' masquerade had ended decades earlier, but the lessons learned during those months of deception continued to influence every decision Sarah May made as ranch owner and community leader. She understood what it meant to be powerless and frightened, to depend on the kindness of others for survival, to face each day uncertain whether safety would last until sunset. These experiences made her a compassionate employer and a generous neighbor, someone who used her wealth and influence to create opportunities for others, rather than simply accumulating more power for herself. As Sarah May grew older, she often reflected on the chain of events that had brought her from Charleston's ballrooms to Arizona's endless skies. The telegram that had summoned her west had been intended for her mother, but Catherine's death had redirected fate in ways no one could have predicted. The servant girl's deception had been born of desperation, but it had led to discoveries that transformed two lives completely. The rancher's recognition had come not from logic but from love, the kind of deep connection that transcends time and circumstance to bring healing where it is needed most. The Double Diamond Ranch stood as monument to the power of truth, the importance of family, and the mysterious ways that love could bridge any gap between past and present, between parent and child, between the dreams we abandon and the realities we create. Sarah May had come west pretending to be someone she wasn't, but in the vast honesty of the desert, surrounded by people who judged actions rather than backgrounds, she had discovered who she truly was meant to be. The servant girl's masquerade had ended with the revelation of deeper truths that none of them could have imagined, proving that sometimes the greatest deceptions lead to the most authentic lives, and that love, in all its forms, remains the most powerful force for transformation in a world that often seems designed to keep hearts apart rather than bring them together in the perfect harmony of understanding and acceptance.